Hey everyone, this is James here, going to be talking more about Italian genre films today, specifically about Damiano Damiani, his violent dramas, basically his terrific run of Eurocrime films that lasted from kind of the late 60s into the 80s, although I suppose you could quibble about when is the last kind of very good one he did, because he was still working quite late into kind of the Italian film industry. So definitely one of, in my opinion, the most important Eurocrime poliziotteschi directors. I was really happy to see Radiant Films releasing a bunch of his different films. The Cosa Nostra box set, definitely go check that out. Reviewed those films, as well as Goodbye and Amen, another great one from the 1977, so the mid to late 70s. So in this episode, going to be talking about Damiani, what makes his films great, some of the characteristics, as well as recommending some of the different films to watch for those that maybe have yet to take a leap or maybe want to fill in some of their gaps here. So Damiani started directing films in the 1960s. He started relatively late. He was previously a painter, so born, I think, 1922. So he was in his 40s or about 40 by the time he was actually directing films. And so he would direct a bunch of films in the 60s. I have not seen all of his 60s output, but I have seen a handful of them. Lipstick, which is kind of a crime drama to some extent. Probably his most famous one is A Bullet for the General. And my trajectory with Damiani films was really with that film. That for many, many years, that was the only Damiani film I watched, A Bullet for the General, which is one of the best spaghetti westerns, I would say. I'd say it's definitely a genre classic there. I'd say it's amongst maybe the best 10 or so. And that's a film that I think a lot of people will know him for. The other one being Amityville II, which is an even more bizarre film to know him for. But anyways, A Bullet for the General is a really interesting film that can be taken as very symbolic towards the kind of U.S. involvement with the CIA and things like that in South America. It was written by a very, very political writer, Franco Salinas, who wrote a lot of those Zapata westerns as well as The State of Siege. So he had his hands kind of all over a lot of these kind of overtly very, very political topics. And I think A Bullet for the General is very good. That's a great John Maria Voyante. So if you haven't seen that one, check that out. But I suspect if you're watching this, that's a film that probably most Italian genre films fans have already seen. And so when I started to get into Eurocrime poliziotteschi years later, I was watching these films. I was like, wait, that name is familiar. So I clicked on like the IMDb or Letterboxd link, whatever. I was like, oh, it's the Bullet for the General guy, who I had not figured had done too much other films. He ended up doing one other spaghetti western, which I had not seen either. Not particularly good. A Genius, Two Friends, and an Idiot. But he really, really left his mark, in my opinion, of the Eurocrime films, which is just an underseen genre, period. But he did just a lot of these films, unlike the spaghetti westerns, where he did two, one of which is very good and the other which is not. And then the other one, of course, is Amityville II, which is very much kind of a bizarre one-off. And I actually quite like that film, but it is not particularly indicative of Damiani's talents or kind of like what he was about as far as the film industry goes. The other one that I suspect Italian viewers might be aware of is he was, to my understanding, the showrunner of La Piovra, which is a big Italian show in 1984, I think is the first season. And I think he only did it for the first season of that show, but that was a huge success, one of the biggest kind of television successes there. And so that's him working kind of well past the kind of industry prime of the Italian film industry there. So he was one of those directors that worked almost all the way until he was 80. You could argue how good his later output is, but he certainly had the cachet and wasn't forced into retirement like some of the lesser directors were. So he outlasted in many ways kind of the Italian genre film industry too. And his films are definitely genre, but definitely have a little bit more of a prestige and social consciousness to it. In fact, I think they're very, very accessible, especially for kind of Western, maybe even American viewers. Paolo Margheriti, I believe, called him one of the most American filmmakers working in Italy at the time. Just kind of his moral centric, like his the morality, the way that it makes its way into his films. I don't see that necessarily as a diss. In fact, I like the way that he approaches things, and I find them to be pretty accessible as an American. So definitely one of those that's a little bit less in the, kind of the grindhouse camp than your Lenzi's or Castellari even. Okay, so let's go on to kind of what is a Damiani film. And so Sergio Leone actually worked with Damiani on that second failed spaghetti western I was just talking about, A Genius, Two Friends, and an Idiot. And he said he made a mistake in having Damiani direct it. They did not get along particularly well. He said that Damiani had no feel for comedy whatsoever, and he really was more of a director of good, violent dramas. And I think that puts it very well, because in some ways you could say these are kind of genre crime films, and I would agree with that. But in other ways, these are kind of dramas front and center with a lot of talking, very strong characterizations and things like that. But there's an inherent violent core at a ton of these different films. And so I think that's a perfect way to put it. So credits to Sergio Leone, not that he needs credit for anything, for really describing what I think kind of Damiani's run of films, violent dramas. Just a perfect way to put it. So he's probably most well known for kind of this mafia Sicilian setting. And so you notice that carried over all the way to La Piovra in the 80s. But it really started with films like The Day of the Owl, The Most Beautiful Wife, coming out in the late 60s. So Damiani was directing films set in Sicily, centered around the mafia and kind of its pervasive feeling and institutions just kind of built into southern Italy that way. So it's something that he would kind of come back to time and time again throughout the career. He'd go back to Sicily for something like How to Kill a Judge. So in that sense, it's a little different from the other Eurocrime films, which tend to be set more in like northern Italy. You'll have a lot of films set in Milan or Rome and that kind of thing. And Damiani did a couple of those as well. But he did focus more on kind of the southern Italian setting than I think some of the other directors did. He also, so another funny thing about kind of me knowing him as a Bullet for the General guy is he has a ton of screenwriting credits. In fact, he has screenwriting credits for just about every film he does, the exception being some of his earlier work. So A Bullet for the General, I don't think he has a screenwriting credit for that. I'm not sure if he has a screenwriting credit for Amityville II or not. That'd be a good question. But his fingerprints are very, very much all over these films, and you get the feeling that he has a certain style of film that he really, really likes to select. He's always saying something specifically about institutions and kind of the ability of individuals to take them on. There's a lot of individuals taking on institutions in his films and failing. So there's definitely kind of a pervasive pessimism that runs throughout all of his work. Kind of I would say kind of the films that you would put on his tombstone if you kind of wanted to have the big ones. I would say A Bullet for the General, definitely Confessions of a Police Captain, I Am Afraid, I think is one really underrated one. Like a lot of Damiani category, a lot of it is very, very underrated. Day of the Owl, that's a big one. The Case is Closed, Forget It. La Piovra, and Amityville II. You just got to put Amityville II on, I guess, even though it's very, very different from his films. Perhaps that's why you would put it on. In the research for this episode, I was watching kind of different special features on some of the discs, and so one of the interviews I did come across was with Antonio Siciliano, who was his editor and worked with him on quite a few films, and talked about how Damiani was just a very, very methodical storyboarder, where he mapped everything out, and as a result, the films are very, very complete and could be kind of pieced together very clearly. So in that sense, I think he's a very, very clear storyteller. He didn't shoot as much footage as other directors necessarily would, so he could tell stories in a fairly efficient visual way. So again, he was a painter before too, so while he doesn't have kind of the pizzazz of someone like Argento or Bava or some of those great giallo directors, he was very competent visually, like a lot of the great Italian directors of the time. He also has kind of great scores, great composers that he was able to work with. He didn't have like a consistent one necessarily, but he worked with a lot of them multiple times, such as like people like Rizzo Ortolani. Pretty sure Morricone scored a couple of his as well. The cinematography in a lot of his films is really, really great too. He worked with, like, for instance, the great Luigi Cavalier and I Am Afraid, and what's the other one? Goodbye and Amen. I think he worked with him on a couple others too. So a lot of the world-class craftsmen that Italy had at the time working in cinema. He was able to take advantage of that, and I think it really shows, especially with some of like the restorations of these films done by Radiant. Really appreciate those, because I think it allows the visuals to really, really shine. I just watched the Goodbye and Amen last week, and just thumbs up on visually, and especially that conclusion and some of the silhouettes and things there. One thing that's interesting, and I did mention this earlier, is that Damiani is a little bit further away from the grindhouse versus someone like Lindsay. Perhaps as a result of having denser stories that focus on different things and are trying to say stuff about institutions, his films tend to run a little bit longer. Are they a little bit slower? Yes, I would say they are a little bit slower, but they're not. These are by no means kind of like European art house or anything like that. So they're not glacially paced. I think they run at exactly the right pace that they should. There's a very few Damiani films where I would be like, okay, yeah, we should cut some. Even though I am a big lover of 90-minute films, Damiani was just not doing very many 90-minute films. He was just a little bit more ambitious than that. Yeah, and his whole filmography is filled with just people attacking institutions over and over and failing. In some cases, that's the mafia, and that's probably what he's most known for. But you extrapolate that out, and you see kind of people attacking the prison system. In the cases closed, forget it. Criminal justice, the American CIA, and Goodbye and Amen. Kind of shadowy government institutions, and I Am Afraid. So there's just a repeated kind of institutions, and then the protagonists are attacking them. And even when he goes into kind of like these more shadow realms, something like I'm Afraid or Goodbye and Amen, I feel like he does it in a way that feels less like a Illuminati and more in kind of like this realistic way. It always feels grounded in a way that doesn't feel too woo-woo, like something like, I don't know, Oliver Stone's JFK is, as much as I do like that film. In fact, in some of his films, he does a great job of kind of weaving the way that these corrupt institutions will find them ways into this system. So this is spoilers for this film, but Confessions of a Police Captain, a big point of it is that the bodies from the mafia who is helping to kind of like spur this development that are happening are just being built into the concrete walls of the development that's happening. And so that's a way that literally there are dead bodies buried in the walls of this thing. It's just the corruption and things at the heart of these kind of core institutions are very, very central to his work. His heroes are also very, very interesting as a result too. And I think on close examination, they're very, very unusual. You have people that are kind of desperately lashing out against the system, like Martin Balsam, but then you also have people on kind of the opposite end, very reluctant people like Voyante and I Am Afraid. Brigadier Graciano is his name. Or you have the naive, like Nero in Day of the Owl. So the protagonists are not all the same, but they all end up against the system for some reason or another. And he just did very good at highlighting kind of the futility and about how all of these people are ultimately pawns. Not everyone dies necessarily, but a lot of his endings are very, very stereotypically downbeat. Okay, yeah, and so, like a lot of the great cinematographers and composers that he worked with, he also worked with a lot of the great Italian actors at the time. He worked with Franco Nero 4 times, which is interesting because you don't necessarily know him as kind of like Corbucci does with Nero, but he worked with him on Confessions of a Police Captain, and as well as all of the films in the Cosa Nostra box set, The Case Closed, Forget It, The Day of the Owl, and How to Kill a Judge. All very good films. Worked with Giuliano Genema on a couple, The Warning and A Man on His Knees. He worked with the great Voyante in a couple as well, A Bullet for the General and I Am Afraid. So worked with a lot of just very, very good actors at the time. Okay, so last of all, let's wrap up on which films to tackle. So, in my opinion, so he did 9 kind of in this big period of kind of the years of lead. 10 if you want to include Sicilian Connection. And some of his 60s work looks like crime films too. I have not seen everything. I have not seen Sicario because I have not been able to find it subtitled. So he did have kind of a body of work that stretched over quite a bit of time. I would say the main film to check out early, the first one, is The Day of the Owl. This is based off of a very important, very popular Italian novel. And so it tackles kind of the Sicilian mafia in the South. It's just a very, very well done, complete film. Next up, I would say Confessions of a Police Captain, which just comes a few years later, also set in Sicily. I've mentioned this one a couple times. I think this might be this might be my favorite of his Sicilian set films. It has a great Martin Balsam. You have the great Franco Nero in this film as well. Good kind of companion to those. They show a very, very different Sicily. That one is less about, it's a little bit less about mafia in the same way. And then finally, I'm going to recommend the very, very underrated I Am Afraid that came out in 1977 with just a wonderful performance by Gian Maria Vogliante, probably my favorite of all the performances in these Damiani films. Just a really, really reserved role that is a complete contrast with another famous one at the time, Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion. Good, I think it's an Ortolani score there, great Keveiler cinematography, and that's one that's a slow burn. So if you're like me and you like these like slow burn, paranoid 1970s stories, this one's a great one to check out and super underseen. Definitely less seen than either of the previous two films I mentioned. Okay, so that wraps up my kind of episode on Damiani's violent dramas. Probably going to come back to him definitely at some point and do an episode, find some interesting angle to tackle some of his other films too. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.